Is Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Okay, this will be a good video to watch, and this will give me a jumping off point to start talking about Afghanistan for all our random new viewers who just joined the chat.
Geopolitics in focus today with the Taliban taking control of Afghanistan's capital city. CNBC's Dan Murphy joins us now with the latest. Hey, Dan.
Well, Leslie, as we speak right now, the UN Secretary General is addressing an emergency summit of the UN Security Council. I wanted to bring you across some of those headlines. First, the Secretary General saying that the Taliban needs to exercise utmost restraint to protect lives. At the same time, the Secretary General saying that all countries should be willing to receive Afghan refugees and refrain from deportations. We're also getting news out suggesting that the UN Security Council is also concerned about what it is seeing as chilling reports of severe restrictions on human rights, particularly concerned by mounting violations against women and girls with the Taliban.
So, for one, you see that the UN is already in communications with the Taliban, asking them to, use restraint and not kill people. Like I said, the Taliban is not the same kind of organization as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right? I just don't support the Taliban. I definitely consider them like an extremist group, but they're not like a violent, they're a guerrilla group, a guerrilla movement in rural Afghanistan, but they're not like ISIS, right? They're not like Al-Qaeda, where they're like, any American is a dead American, and they're posting like beheading videos and stuff like that. It's not like that. It's a guerrilla movement, and then you hear them say the UN Security Council, though, was saying they're very concerned for women's rights and concerned for all these things now that the U.S. is withdrawing. And the UN Security Council is made up of like the U.S., France, the U.K., China, and then is it still only like five? When it was founded, it was 5 countries. So that could just be the U.S. and their allies being like, oh, we're worried about human rights. We need to send troops back in. Whereas the UN is the rest of the UN is communicating with the Taliban, trying to evacuate people, trying to open up other countries to refugees, which is good. But there's always going to be forces in these apparatuses like the UN or like in the Pentagon and in the U.S. government itself, who are directly tied to the military-industrial complex or directly tied to corporations who are making a ton of money off these wars, and, they're always going to come out against it. Which, I don't know if that's what's going on there with the UN Security Council, and there are, legitimate concerns for human rights abuses, because the Taliban took over the country and the president just fled, obviously, but as we've been saying over and over and over again, if the U.S. would have left at any point over the last 20 years, it would have been very similar result. An extremist group would have taken over, and the Taliban, relative to other extremist groups, is not necessarily the worst. But what are they supposed to do? That's the thing, right? I mean, what the U.S. should have done was allowed the democratic Marxist government who came to power in the 70s, who wanted equal rights for women, to take power. What they did instead was funneled money and weapons into the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden, who eventually splintered off into Al-Qaeda, who then attacked the U.S. at 9/11, and we said, oh, now we have to invade Afghanistan to fight terrorism, even though the terrorists we were fighting were the same people we funded when they were fighting communism. So the destabilization in Afghanistan and the fighting going on between extremist groups and the Taliban taking power in the power vacuum that's been left by the U.S. 100% would have happened if the U.S. didn't try and destabilize this country and rob them of their resources for the last 40 years.
Taliban now effectively in control of Afghanistan. This also comes as President Joe Biden faces growing criticism, even from some allies in Washington, about his handling of the exit in Afghanistan. At this hour, we understand White House officials are now discussing how Biden should address the Taliban's rapid rise to power and the extraordinary images that we are seeing coming out of Kabul airport in particular. I know you've been flagging this earlier on in the show, but I wanted to show you the latest vision from the airport, where we see Afghans clamoring around a moving US Air Force plane. Some people clinging to the wheels here and fuselage in pure desperation, others running alongside, hoping to get a ride out because it's their only option now. Commercial flights being cancelled and the US focusing on its own evacuation efforts. Also today, Reuters reporting that 5 people...
That is absolutely insane. But, regardless of what the Taliban was doing, people want to get out of Afghanistan anyways. So we have all these people on the ground and interpreters, and sadly enough, they'll hire Afghani people, generally people who are addicted to all the opium that's being grown, and they'll have them walk in front of the U.S. troops and step on landmines for the U.S. troops. And the reason they're willing to do that is, if they do it for 2 years or whatever, as do all these people working with the U.S., they'll get like a green card and they'll have their trip to the U.S. facilitated because Afghanistan's in such an impoverished, destabilized situation because of U.S. meddling for the last 40 plus years. So, regardless of the Taliban taking over the country or not, a lot of people want to come over here, and the U.S. has been one of the main facilitators of people coming over here, and I see people asking in the chat, what do I think should be done? Obviously, the U.S. has created a mess at this point. It is a mess. Like I said, if they would have withdrawn at any point, some other group would have taken power in the vacuum left by the U.S. Afghanistan essentially had no stable government, as you see by their president leaving right away. So yeah, all we should do is just open up our border to refugees as much as we can, and help people escape. But then, give Afghanistan mutual support and trade, and try and promote stabilizing their country, and yeah, like we haven't done for the last 40 years. But that's not going to happen because the U.S. is an imperialist oligarchy run by a handful of bankers and real estate capitalists like Donald Trump.
People were killed in the calamity at the Kabul airport. However, NBC News has not been able to independently verify that reporting. And just hours before all of this unfolded, we also saw extraordinary scenes of the Taliban inside the Afghan presidential palace after CNBC here in the Middle East was able to confirm that the Afghan president had left the country fearing for his own safety and leaving to avoid bloodshed, as he described it. Now, this outcome wasn't necessarily unexpected.
Again, this is bad and this is horrible, but this is something that Americans generally don't even know about Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, during the winter, it's much harder for people to get food and water to survive. It's like harder to walk maybe 5 miles to get your family water in the winter, so a lot of people die of starvation and freezing and stuff like that. So that's when a lot of the fighting stops. A lot of the extremist groups or just political groups who are fighting each other, at war with each other, stop fighting for the winter because it's much more difficult conditions. And then when the winter starts to end is what's called the fighting season. And that's when all these different extremist groups in this destabilized country trying to fight for power start fighting again. And now that the U.S. has withdrawn, of course one of these groups has actually taken power. But this has been going on in Afghanistan constantly, and people have constantly been dying, and Americans just haven't been aware of it until, our troops are finally leaving for the first time in 20 years, right? The American media wasn't reporting about the fighting season and all the dead people in Afghanistan until all of a sudden the U.S. military is leaving, right? So very telling.
Expected, but of course the speed of the Taliban's takeover did come as a surprise. The Biden administration now defending that US mission in Afghanistan and the decision to withdraw. Number of questions still remain though, including what does the future of Afghan leadership look like now? We're likely to hear more from the UN Security Council on this in a statement that's likely to be released later on today. At the same time, how do we explain now the Taliban's longevity after 20 years of American investment on the ground?
America works with the groups on the ground. We've been there for so long, and they said the goal in Afghanistan was to get Al-Qaeda, and now Al-Qaeda, has been diminished so that ISIS and there's another group called the PUM who are there, and the Taliban are the main groups. But the U.S. works with them and talks with them, and the Taliban is a lot more friendly towards the U.S. than ISIS. So these news reporters are acting like, oh, how did the Taliban survive even though we were there for 20 years? You have no idea what we were even doing there for the last 20 years, right? The U.S. works with the Taliban, because their whole goal isn't to actually stabilize the country and actually take out all the bad guys. The world doesn't work like a comic book movie. Our goal was to extract their resources, and we did that for years, extracted millions in mineral wealth and oil and, the black market through opium. So these news outlets don't have any idea what's been going on in Afghanistan for the last 20 plus years.
Hard lessons to be learned and reflected on here. And the bottom line, where was the Afghan army in all of this as well? Why was it not able to protect Afghan civilians as the US withdrew? And now also questions about the future of Afghanistan and whether or not it is going to be a harbor for terrorists globally. A lot of questions yet to be answered, guys.
I hope it doesn't become a harbor for terrorists globally. I hope it doesn't become like Saudi Arabia, a country perpetrating a genocide in Yemen, who funds and props up extremist groups all around the Middle East, who receive billions of dollars in funding and keep lucrative deals with United States weapons companies, right? It's always, it's never Saudi Arabia or Israel who sponsor terrorism in the Middle East, right? It's never these countries that the U.S. military-industrial complex is funneling millions of dollars in weapons to, right? It couldn't be those countries who are the state sponsors of terrorism. It's always wherever the U.S. is withdrawing troops. But yeah. Taliban will take it back to the Stone Age. All women's rights will be destroyed. I mean, they don't have that much to begin with, outside of Kabul, rural Afghanistan. But we'll see. I honestly don't know what will happen. Obviously, it's not good. I see people saying, I don't want civilians to die. Of course not, right? Which is why we support the working class of Afghanistan taking power and stabilizing the country, which they did in the 70s, but the U.S. funded extremist groups to destroy that movement. So now, the best thing we can do is get U.S. troops, get the U.S. empire out of there, and hopefully the people of Afghanistan can stabilize their country and eventually build, democratic, hopefully Marxist government like they were trying to in the 70s. We stabilize them by arming Afghanistanis against the far-right Taliban. I mean, we've been arming people. Do you really trust, though, the U.S. government and the CIA to arm people? Because the last time we said, hey, guys, arm the good guys in Afghanistan, they gave all the weapons and money to Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen, who fought the left-wingers, killed the left-wingers, and then attacked the United States and the Twin Towers 10 or 20 years later. And then we invaded the country and occupied them, apparently to fight those guys, who we had previously funded. Because when the government is a dictatorship of capital, right? The U.S. State Department, the U.S. military, the bodies of armed men that belong to the U.S. government are not actually, they don't actually care about human rights. They don't actually care about stabilization. They don't actually care about saving civilian lives. They care about extracting resources and selling a lot of weapons. So if we say, hey, you guys fund the good guys in Afghanistan who are going to help us out and are going to fight the right-wingers, that's not going to happen, right? The reason the U.S. is leaving is probably because they know, I don't know. I don't want to go that far and say why they're leaving. But, there's nothing the U.S. military or U.S. intelligence organizations are going to do to stabilize any other country. They don't do that. That's not their intention. That's not their goal. Except when they loaned a bunch of money to European countries, their allies after World War II. Taliban didn't have control and power before it was somewhat stabilized. Before when? When the U.S. was there? When the U.S. was occupying them? I mean, it was nonstop fighting. Like I said, in the country, it would be impossible for the country to develop themselves outside of Kabul because millions in their resources are being extracted. Like, yeah, it's going to be a change in government. It's going to be a change in form. And it's, the Taliban taking power right now. People are going to die. But, there's nothing, the fighting is never going to stop. The death is never going to stop. And especially the poverty is never going to stop as long as the U.S. empire is there stealing all their wealth. So, even if it's not good that the Taliban took over, obviously it's not. But the U.S. needs to get out of there at some point. And if they wouldn't have intervened 40 years ago, the Taliban wouldn't be taking over right now.